All right. Well, it is about 2 o'clock, so we will get started slowly. I'm anticipating that a couple more people will trickle in as we get moving. But I do want to just kind of preface our session today, let you know what we're looking at, and then we'll dive into everything together. So, as I have done in the past, I'll just go ahead and put the link to the agenda in the chat. And previously, the agenda was mostly just so that we could look at the different topics that we were going to address. But today, I actually have some resources that are linked in the agenda, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. But it may be helpful to open the agenda just so that you can get access to those resources. Um, Now, as you can see, after you've opened that up, we are on session 5 out of 6 at this point. And our goal today is to start talking about how we can use Canvas to personalize learning. And today, more of the focus is going to tend towards getting students to collaborate and how we can use some collaboration to personalize learning. And the next session, we're going to talk about how Canvas can create individualized learning pathways for students. So with that in mind, our steps today are first off, we're going to just briefly touch on collaborative learning. And then after that, we are going to start looking at Canvas by looking at peer review assignments and how peer reviews can function inside of Canvas. That conversation is going to be a little bit trickier for me to demonstrate because it is a big challenge to demonstrate peer reviews in just a sample sandbox course in Canvas because I don't have any actual students in there and I don't want to do peer reviews in a course where I actually do have students. So I'm going to give you some screenshots. I'm going to point you to some examples. I'm going to explain the process, but I'm not going to be able to show everything in quite as much detail as I have for other features. So just bear that in mind. We'll kind of work through that together. And again, I'm going to give you a bunch of resources there. After we talk about peer reviews, we're then going to talk about how to create groups in Canvas. And groups are really interesting in Canvas because you can kind of organize students however you need to. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Along those same lines, we'll talk about how to create group assignments. And then after that, we're going to just briefly touch on some of the things that we've already discussed that also play into this bigger conversation about personalized learning. And as you can see on the agenda, some of those things include item banks, flexible due dates, and then accommodations in quizzes. So with that all said, we are going to spend the majority of our time today talking about peer reviews and groups inside of Canvas because those are the new topics. And then we'll probably spend, I'm guessing, like the last 15-ish minutes today talking about those last 3 bullet points because, again, we've touched on those at different points in time. But today I just want to bring them together to talk about how those features in particular could facilitate personalized learning in your classroom. So with all of that said, are there any questions I can answer before we get started today? All right, perfect. Well, we will go ahead and dive in. As per usual, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll refer back to the chat every now and then, so I will see that, maybe just not immediately. And then also, if you have a question that you feel like would be easier for me to answer if I just responded right then, feel free to just come off of mute and interrupt me, and that's fine too. That's not a big deal. Now, all of that said, I do want to go ahead and get into peer reviews and what peer reviews look like in Canvas. So the very first thing I want to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat, and this link is to one of Instructure's help guides on how to implement peer reviews in your Canvas course. I'm going to put that in the chat. It's also linked in the agenda, so if you want to just click on the link, that says like Canvas help guide in the agenda, that's fine too. It will take you to the same place. But I want to make sure that you have that available because I'm going to share my screen to talk through a couple of screenshots, and then we'll get into Canvas and we'll look at how to set it up. So as you can see, either on your own tab or on my screen at this point, peer reviews in Canvas kind of have 2 different halves to them. as most things do, right? They have the teacher side, and then they also have the student side. Now, on the teacher side, you have a few options, and this is described in the help guide, so it may feel like I'm just reiterating what's in here, but I promise I'm going to go into a little bit more depth in just a second. But the options that you have with peer reviews are you can create any assignment in Canvas and have students provide each other feedback. Now, you can set up those peer review assignments so that Canvas automatically assigns peer reviews to different students, or you as the instructor can manually assign those peer reviews yourself. That is what we see in this top screenshot that's right here in the help guide. And in particular, if you look on the left-hand side here, this is the teacher's control for how to manually assign peer reviews. And we'll look at that in more depth in just a second. The other thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that peer reviews are a little bit funky in Canvas. And they're funky for a couple of reasons. But the main reason that I want to address right now is because let's say that I have an assignment that I've created in Canvas that's like maybe argumentative essay. And I'm asking students to write an argumentative essay and then provide each other with feedback on those essays. Now, the argumentative essay assignment is an assignment in and of itself that will go in the gradebook. However, if I add peer reviews to that assignment, the peer review isn't necessarily its own assignment. So it will still show up in students' to-do list, like you see over here on the right on the screen, on the screenshot. However, unless you create your own additional peer review assignment, students won't necessarily receive a grade for completing the peer review. So with that said, as I move into Canvas and as I step through demonstrating how I might set up a peer review, I want you to keep in mind that simply assigning a peer review does not necessarily mean that students are going to get credit for it until you create a second assignment. And we'll look at that process together. The one last thing that I'll point out on this help guide before we go further is just the second screenshot. And this may be something that you possibly already assumed, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page, where after a student has completed a peer review for their peer will see their comments and feedback in the same place that a student might receive your feedback if you as the teacher were delivering feedback to them. So in this screenshot, you can see that this is from a student's perspective. So the student has submitted this document here, this assignment document, and you can see that they've received this peer review feedback here. So it will say what that peer review's comments are. And then additionally, that student can open up the rubric and see how their peer scored them according to the assignment rubric. If the peer provides feedback and then you as the instructor also provide feedback, you would just see your comments right below the peer's comments. And then when students go to open up the rubric, they'd be able to see the rubric score from the peer and the rubric score from you. So hopefully that gave you kind of a general overview of what we're about to look at. But before we dive into an actual more tangible example of how this might work in Canvas, can I respond to any questions or clarify any of the things that I just mentioned there? All right. Well, we'll keep moving then. So now I'm going to move over to Canvas. I'm going to go into the same sandbox course that I've used in our past sessions. So again, this is an empty course where I could just poke around without breaking anything. And we have this module up here. I've occasionally added things to this. I've removed things from this. But today I'm going to add a couple more assignments to it. One of those assignments is going to be our peer review example assignment that I'm going to do right now. So I'm just going to title this peer review example. Also, I would say that if you are one who likes to follow along, this is a good opportunity to do that. So if you haven't logged into Canvas, you can go ahead and start moving that direction if you'd like to. Or if it suits you better to just watch, you're welcome to do that too. Now, what I've done is I've gone ahead and added my assignment to the module. Again, I could do that by clicking on the plus sign in the module or going to assignments and creating a new assignment that way. But once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and open up that peer review assignment, and I'm going to start editing the details for it. Now, as we've talked about in the past, I can add whatever instructions or content I need to using the rich content editor, which is this box here. For the time being, I'm just going to put instructions here so that we know that that's where content would go. And then below that, a couple of sessions ago, we talked about all of these assignment settings. So I can put in the points that it's worth, and I'm just going to say 10 today to keep it simple. I can put the gradebook category that I want it to go in, and let's say this is an assessment. I could choose the submission type. Today, I'm going to choose an online submission with text entry. I could set how many submission attempts I want. And then I also have the ability to make it a group assignment or to require peer reviews. And these are the two elements that we're going to be focusing on today. Right now, we'll look at peer reviews in particular. However, before I get to the peer reviews, I also want to put in a due date for this assignment because that will impact how the peer reviews function. So I'm going to go ahead and just set the due date as Friday, and we'll say Friday at midnight. And we'll say it's just open right now, and we'll give people maybe an extra week to turn that in, and it's going to close on October 4th. Now, once I've set up my assignment to be whatever I want it to be, I would also recommend adding a rubric because that's going to provide a lot of guidance for your students as they complete the peer review and honestly, as they complete the assignment too. So I'm going to save this for the time being. And then I'm going to go ahead and add my rubric to this. Now, we'll just say that this is my peer review example again. And I'm not going to make this a complicated rubric just for the sake of time, but we'll just say that I have two things. So let's say one of the things I'm grading on is grammar. And we'll just keep it as 5 points or 0 points. And then maybe the other thing that I'm grading on is depth of the response, and I'll just say depth. And then again, for today, we could just keep that as 5 points or 0 points. Now, your rubrics will probably be a lot more complex than this, and they will hopefully have a lot more description than this. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how I might add that rubric so that when we are in the peer review, you can see how that will function. Now, I'm also going to use this rubric for assignment grading, and then I'll hit create rubric. After everything has been set up, so after I have put in my instructions, after I've put in my content, after I've said how many points it's worth, built my rubric, so on and so forth, I'm going to go back to edit. And I'm going to go back to this peer review box that I kind of glazed over just a minute ago. Now, as you can see, by default, it's unchecked. By default, you're not requiring peer reviews for your assignments. However, when I check this, I'm going to get a few more options. Now, I want to talk through some of these options so that you have an idea of the types of control you have. And as I talk through them, I want you to think of your own teaching context because I'm actually going to ask you a question in just a minute. So with that said, my first few options are how do I want to assign peer reviews? The default option is as the teacher, I can manually assign those peer reviews. And we'll look at that in more depth in just a second, but that's exactly what it sounds like, where as the teacher, I would say, Johnny is going to review Stephen, Sarah is going to review Clarissa, so on and so forth. Automatically assigning peer reviews, though, will set it so that at some moment in time that you have defined for Canvas right here in this box, at some moment in time, students are going to automatically be assigned a partner and a peer review based on Canvas just randomly shuffling names. Now, as you can see, I can require students to complete as many peer reviews as I want. So maybe in my class, for some reason, I want students to conduct 8 peer reviews. I want them to give feedback to 8 of their peers. That's probably a little bit excessive, maybe not, depending on your context and what you're doing with the assignment. But generally, most people oftentimes just put like 1 in there. Maybe they put 2, maybe they put 3, but you can put whatever number you need. For today's example, I'm going to just say 2. So students are going to be responsible for providing feedback to at least 2 of their peers. Right below that, though, you'll notice that I have this box. And the text beneath that box is really important. It's also very small and very light. So it just says, if this box is blank, use the due date. Here's what that means. If I don't put any date in this box, then Canvas is going to automatically assign peer reviews as soon as the due date hits. Our due date is Friday at 11:59 p.m. So that means Friday at 11:59 p.m., every student who has submitted the assignment will then be assigned a peer review. Now, note here that students must first submit the assignment in order to be assigned a peer review. However, this gets a little bit complicated. And here's where I want to ask you a question because I want you to kind of think through this. And you could just respond to the question in the chat. Let's say that I leave this blank. And so Canvas is just going to automatically assign peer reviews once the due date hits. As I mentioned before, if a student has not submitted an assignment, they will not be assigned any peer reviews. With that information in mind, what potential issues do you foresee in just leaving this blank? What problems could a teacher run into? Maybe not you, but maybe another teacher. What issues could someone run into? Again, just kind of brainstorm in the chat. I'll give you a second here. I want to see if you're picking up what I'm getting at. Canvas automatically assigns peer reviews right when the due date hits. And students only get peer reviews if they've submitted the assignment. What type of issues could I run into as an instructor? Ah, Jamie, you nailed it. Yes, students might be tempted to turn in the assignment late so that they don't get assigned a peer review. Or maybe they're not trying to avoid the peer review, they just happen to be late and then they don't get a peer review, right? And so that dynamic can get a little bit tricky. Now, I do want to say that let's say Susie turns in her assignment on September 28th, and so Canvas doesn't assign her a peer review. As the teacher, I am still capable of going in and manually assigning a peer review to Susie. So I can take care of that issue for Susie. However, if you are in a situation where students frequently turn things in late, it might be beneficial for you to create a little bit of a buffer here in this window. A couple of examples. I taught high school language arts. And I was fortunate enough to teach right during the pandemic and pandemic era, which means that I would oftentimes receive late assignments. In order to help mitigate the amount of manually assigning peer reviews that I had to do myself, what I might do is I might say, okay, everyone, your assignment, your essay, whatever it is due Wednesday night. And let me actually go ahead and change this due date so that I can show you this example. So let's say that it's due tonight at midnight. I might not set this assign reviews option until maybe Monday morning at like 4 a.m. Because then what I can do is, as the teacher, I can come to my students on Friday. I met with my students every other day. So I can come to my students on Friday and be like, oh no, only half of you submitted the assignment. Make sure to do that. Open up your Chromebook right now and submit it. And I could give them that reminder on Friday and hopefully get more students to turn it in. But then on Monday, I'm going to want them to actually do the peer review. And so I'm going to have Canvas assign those peer reviews automatically Monday morning before they come into class. So once they get to class, they then see the peer review that they're responsible for handling. Does that make sense? Can I respond to any questions there? Do I need to clarify anything along those lines? Okay. If you want a little bit more clarity, feel free to just type something in the chat. I'm happy to clarify because I know that that can be a little bit funky, but that's just a tip to think through. Is it sometimes helpful to add this buffer? In other situations, though, if you have a really hard deadline and it's like, you know what, it's due Friday night at midnight, I am not accepting any late assignments. The assignment will not allow you to submit after that point. Go ahead and just leave this blank. Maybe it doesn't matter so much, but if you are someone who's receiving a lot of late assignments, just keep that in mind. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to toggle this back to manually assign peer reviews so that you can see what it looks like as a teacher to have to create those. So I'm going to go to manually assign peer reviews, and then I'll hit save and publish. And then once I've done that, you'll be able to see that on the right-hand side, I have a new little option that pops up. That's my peer reviews option. And if I click on peer reviews, you can see that I have a list of names of people who are in this course. Now, because it's a demo course, I only have a couple of demo students. But what I can do is right below those names, I can see who's already been assigned as a peer review for that student. Obviously, because I'm manually assigning the peer reviews, no one's been assigned yet. And then right below that, I have a link to add some peer reviews, and a little drop-down menu appears. And then I can select the student that I want this person to peer review. I can then select another student because I said I wanted 2 peer reviews per person. And those names will appear right below here. Now you're going to see this little warning appear. And that simply means that this person hasn't submitted their assignment yet. And therefore, Val, can't actually do the peer review for this person because they haven't turned in the assignment. There's nothing for Val to peer review. That's what this little warning indicates here. Now, even if you aren't manually assigning your peer reviews, even if you have Canvas automatically assign them, you're still going to get this peer review option as soon as those peer reviews have been assigned. So again, if my assignment was due tonight, but I don't have the peer reviews automatically assigned until Monday morning, I'm not going to be able to see the peer reviews until Monday after 4 a.m. At that point, though, I'm going to have this option appear, and then my screen's going to look exactly the same. It's going to have a list of all of my students, and then under the students' names, it will just say the students who have automatically been assigned peer reviews to that person. Again, you'll be able to control over here how many reviews you want per person, and I think that I can reassign this. Maybe I can't. So after that's in, it's going to actually, no, I'm going to back up. I'm talking over myself. I'm getting ahead. The reason why it didn't automatically reshuffle those when I changed that number is because I had set the assignment to manually assigning students to each person. However, if you are doing the automatic one and you initially said, I want everyone to do 3 peer reviews, but then you change your mind and you're like, that's too much. I only want them to do 1. And you go in and change this box. You can reshuffle those peer reviews again and automatically reassign them, assuming that students haven't conducted any of them yet. If students have already done some of those peer reviews, then you're not going to be able to automatically reshuffle. You could still manually move students around or remove students from a list. So I could say, you know what? Val has already done Braxton. She doesn't need to worry about doing Debs, and I can just delete that name out. However, if no one's turned in the peer review yet, you can automatically reshuffle those. Now, at this point, what questions can I answer about peer reviews? What can I respond to so far? All right, perfect. Well, that kind of demonstrates the background mechanics of how peer reviews work inside of Canvas. However, I also want to give you maybe some suggestions, if you will, on how to make the peer review process run smoothly for your students, because it can be kind of a new experience to use Canvas to do peer reviews. And so we have a couple of suggestions for you. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to hop back to the agenda just to point out some links to you. And actually, I'll put the link to the agenda back in the chat one more time, just so that it's easy to find. It's right there. Now, with that said, there are 5 resources below here, and I just want to talk through some of those resources so that you can find what you need as you begin implementing peer reviews. And then I'm also going to talk through the process that we recommend if you decide to use Canvas peer reviews. So first thing, is this designing peer reviews in Canvas document is a very thorough overview of what we recommend as a step-by-step process for implementing peer reviews in your classroom. With each of those steps, there will be things for you to consider. And then additionally, there will also be links to video explanations that provide you a little bit more detail on exactly what we're talking about. So if I open this up, you can see that it's a pretty big document. It gives you an overview of what a peer review is. I just did that, so you could skip over that section. It has a link to a video. It talks about how to set up your peer review activity. It talks about how to train students and prepare them for the peer review, so on and so forth. So like I said, this is pretty in-depth, but if you're looking for something that will help guide you through the whole process the first time, that can be really helpful. Additionally, right below that, there's links to 3 videos. The top 2 videos, again, are just videos kind of demonstrating what I just talked through, and they step you through the process of setting up your peer reviews in Canvas. So those are there for you to refer back to as needed. This last link, though, is maybe going to be helpful for you because this is something that I can't demonstrate to you today because I don't have any actual students or assignment submissions in my demo course. So this last link is a video from Canvas demonstrating how students would conduct the peer review. So let's say that you as the teacher have set everything up, everything's good to go, everyone's been assigned a peer review. Now students are saying, well, how do I actually do it? This video, I think it's like 4 minutes long, will step them through that process so that they know where to click and where to type and where they can provide their feedback. Again, I wish I could demo that for you today, but I don't have any active students, which is why we're going to have to skip over that part. So with all of that said, those are your resources to refer back to as needed, but I want to give you some ideas for best practices here. So with that in mind, I'm going to go back to my Canvas module. And I'll actually look at it this way. And you can see that I have my peer review example assignment that we just created right here. Now, as I mentioned before, if I don't do anything else, if I just leave it like this, students are going to receive credit for turning in their essay, but they will not receive credit for conducting the peer review. That may or may not be okay with you. That's up to you to decide. Many students, though, kind of expect the peer review to be a separate assignment, in which case you then have to build a second assignment. And so what I might do is I might go into my module and again, create another assignment. And I might say something like peer review assignment or something like that. Add that into my module. And then again, of course, as with any other assignment, I can go in and edit the details as needed. But the details here are probably going to say something like, submit a screenshot of the feedback that you gave your peers on their essay, or record a screencast of you explaining the feedback that you gave to your peers on their essay, something like that. I'm going to direct students to open up the previous assignment again and show me that they actually gave good feedback. And then I'm going to grade them on how effective that feedback was. Now, in my class, I would typically go through a couple of sample assignments and practice assignments where students were asked to provide each other feedback that was really brief and just as basically a practice round for them. And then I'd give them feedback on their feedback in order to prep them for the bigger feedback assignments. And so typically I would support students in that way by making sure that the expectations were really clear before I started grading the quality of their feedback. But the idea here is that in order to actually grade students' feedback process, then you're probably going to need to create a second assignment. So that's just something to keep in mind. For the time being, I'll just say something like submit a screenshot of your feedback from your peer reviews. And I can make this however many points I want. We'll just say 5. Of course, I can adjust all this as needed, but for the time being, I'll just save it and publish it. Now, when I go back to the module, you can see that students are now going to have 2 assignments. So they get points for turning in the essay, they get points for completing the peer review, and perhaps I even make a 3rd assignment where they resubmit the essay with revisions or something like that. But hopefully that kind of demonstrates that simply adding the peer review in and of itself won't create a new section in your gradebook. Now we are at exactly 2:30. We're half of the way through. So I want to pause one more time. What questions can I answer? What can I clarify at this point? All right, perfect. Well, let's go ahead and start talking about groups then and how groups can function in Canvas. And then we'll kind of bring this all together and talk about how we might personalize learning using some of these features. So we're going to go to groups. And in order to get to groups in Canvas, I actually need to start on the People tab. So just know that if you want to create groups, if you are like me, and I don't create groups very often, then typically what happens to me is I'm like, oh, I should create a group. And then I spend roughly like 2 or 3 minutes staring at this menu trying to find groups. It's not an option. You have to go to people first. So keep that in mind. You're going to go to people. And then after you've clicked on people, you're going to see that you're going to have a list of everyone who's enrolled in your course and what their different email addresses are and their roles and so on and so forth. You can even add people if you need to. But the important thing for us today is this button right here that says plus group set. And this is really cool. This is a somewhat recent addition to Canvas, not brand new, but somewhat recent addition, where Canvas allows you to create different sets of groups or different groups of groups. And this will make more sense in just a minute. So once I click on group set, I'm going to get this window that pops up that asks me to name what my group is going to be. I'm going to say that this set of groups is for my final project in my course. Then you can see that I have the option to allow students to sign up for their own groups, or I can leave that unchecked and I can put students in groups myself. You can also see that there is a group structure option. And by default, it's going to say create groups later, which essentially means that you're manually going to create the groups. Or if I click on that, I can split students by the number of groups that exist. If I click on this, Canvas is going to ask me how many groups I want in my class. So maybe I want 5 groups in my class. Maybe I want 6, whatever it is. Or I can also choose that drop down again and say split number of students per group, and it will kind of work the other direction, if that makes sense. Um, I also have this toggle here to require students to be in the same section. So if you are teaching a course that has multiple sections and you know that section 1 meets on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but section 2 meets on Mondays and Wednesdays. And so obviously you need students from this section to only work with students in this section. You can check that if you need to. That may or may not apply to you. And then you can see that Canvas also has the ability to assign a group leader. And this can be a random person. This can be the first person to join the group, or if you leave this unchecked, you as the teacher can assign the group leader. Group leader functionality, essentially, the simple version of it is that they are going to be the person tasked with turning the thing in Canvas. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how that works in just a moment, but just know that the group leader doesn't come with a ton of additional features or anything like that. It's generally speaking just the person who's going to turn in whatever product you're working on. Now, for the time being, so that I can demonstrate how this works, I'm going to go back to this drop-down menu and just say create groups later. Once I've done that, I can hit save. And you'll see that I have a list of students who haven't been assigned to groups. I have a list of groups that exist. And then I also have some new buttons up here. And I can import from a spreadsheet and I can import groups that way, or I can manually create groups myself. And I'm going to do that here. So I'm going to click on plus group and I'm going to say one of the groups that is in my class is the blue group. And again, I can set a number of students who, or I can set a cap for that group. So I don't want any more than 4 students in this group or something like that. And I can hit save. And then I could go back in and make another group and say, I also have a green group, and they are going to have a cap of 4. And I can do that as much as I need to. After I've done that, I can click on this drop down, and then I can drag and drop students into the groups that I want them to be a part of in Canvas. Once I'm happy with that, I can just navigate away from the screen. And then at that point, um, the groups will already be set, and I can start making group assignments for those groups. And I'll show you that in just a moment. Before we navigate away, though, I want to kind of show you how group sets work by creating another one. So you can see right now the group set that I'm on is final project. So on the final project for my course, these students are going to work together, and then Braxton's going to work by himself because he's a problem. But I also can create another set of groups too. So I can go back to my group set button, and I can say, this isn't the final project. This is just maybe the practice assignment that we work on. And I'm going to create groups for later, hit save. And now I can create different groups. And so I might say group 1 instead of group blue group or something like that. I might say something like group 2. And then just like before, I can drag and drop students into those groups, and I could change them up. So now you could see that Braxton is with Deborah now instead of Valerie being with Deborah. And so what that means is when I go to create a group assignment, Canvas is going to ask me which group set I want to use. And I can say, you know what? Today we're using our practice assignment groups. So please organize students this way. Or today we're working on our final project. So please organize students this way. With teachers who are teaching face-to-face in the classroom, what I most commonly see this used as is maybe they have a group set that is something like table groups, and they have their students organized into tables. And then obviously they've put students into the corresponding groups here in Canvas. Or they might have their table groups, and then they might have something like extension groups or even like skill-based groups, something like this. And now these aren't students' table groups. These are groups based on students' performance. And I know that these students are kind of middle-level performers, so I'm going to group them together. These are high performers, so on and so forth. So you could do it a lot of different ways, but the group set option allows you to have multiple categories of groups inside of your Canvas course. I want to pause for just a moment before we go into group assignments and talk about the mechanics of how this works for students. But before I move that direction, are there any questions that I can answer right now? All right, cool. Let's look at group assignments then. So I have created a few groups, and I have a few group sets. You can see that I've kind of gone crazy with mine. I have a bunch of them now. But I'm going to go back to my homepage and this module, and I'm going to again add another assignment. So I'll hit plus, create assignment, and I'll call this group assignment. Um, and we'll say this one's the practice assignment. This is the practice group assignment. And then I can go in, open that up, edit it as much as I need to, provide my instructions to students, add in the point totals, all of those things that we've talked about before. But then the important thing today is I'm going to submit, or say the submission type is online, and we'll just say text entry. And then right below that, I have this toggle that allows me to create groups, a group assignment. So I'm going to check that. And now I have a couple of additional options. So the first option that pops up is, do you want to assign grades to students individually? Now, the way this is going to work is as soon as you click this toggle and say this is a group assignment, what that means is that Canvas is only going to require one student per group that you already created. Remember, we created all those groups a moment ago. It's only going to require one student per group to actually turn in the assignment. So let's say that this is a writing assignment, and I'm having students brainstorm a list of ideas for a research project. I don't know, something like that. Um, And let's say that there are three students in that group. There's John, there's Steve, and there's Clarissa. I have those three kids in there. Canvas is only going to make it so that one of those three can submit the assignment. If I have set the group leader, then the group leader is going to be the only person who can turn that in. So if I said, you know what, Johnny is our group leader, that means Johnny's going to have the option to turn in the assignment. Clarissa and Stephen will not have that option. If I haven't set a group leader, and when I was creating the groups before, I didn't assign a group leader, then any of those students could turn in the assignment. However, as soon as one of them do, then the ability to turn in the assignment disappears from the other ones because I already have the assignment submission for the group. So if Steven goes ahead and submits the assignment, then Johnny and Clarissa no longer are able to because it's already been turned in for them. Then what that will look like for you as the teacher is when you're in SpeedGrader and you're looking at all of the assignment submissions, you're going to see the same submission for Johnny, Clarissa, and Steven. Now, this toggle right below that, though, gives you a little bit more control. And what I mean by that is if I leave this unchecked, then I'm going to see maybe Johnny's version of the assignment first. And remember, it's the same assignment. It's just been duplicated for each of those students. But I might see Johnny's first, and I might look at it and say, you know what, Johnny gets 5 out of 10. As soon as I put 5 out of 10 in for Johnny's score, Canvas will automatically put that in for Stephen and Clarissa's score as well because they are in Johnny's group. If I uncheck this, or if I check this though, that means that when I go and give Johnny 5 out of 10, I'm then going to be able to see Clarissa's assignment. And again, it's going to be the same copy. It's going to be the exact same thing Johnny turned in, but maybe then I can put in 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, whatever the case may be. This assign grades to each student individually is helpful if your students have turned in something that designates who did which part. So if they're turning in a big document with multiple pages, and maybe the top of page 1 says Johnny completed this part, top of page 2 says Stephen completed this part, so on and so forth, then it would probably make sense to check this. However, if you are just receiving like a big project that doesn't necessarily delineate which students did which things, then it probably doesn't make sense to check this. Are there any questions that I can respond to about grading and how that grading component works? All right. You'll see another drop-down menu here, and that new drop-down menu just says select which group set you want to use. So you'll remember that I had a bunch of group sets in my People tab, and I created a couple with you. One of those group sets was the practice assignment group set. So I could say, for this assignment, we're using our practice assignment groups, and that's how students are going to submit the assignments to me. They're going to work in those groups today. But I also have the ability to say, you know what, this is our final project, so I want students to submit things according to their final project groups, and I can toggle that to whatever I need. You'll also notice that I have this button right here where I can click on this, and this window probably looks familiar to you at this point, and I can go ahead and create just a brand new group set right here from the assignment creation screen if I wanted to. So this is a really helpful shortcut for you. I wanted to show you the People tab first so that you knew where to go find things if you need to adjust them after the fact. But if I wanted to just create a group right now from the assignment page, I can do that. And it works through the same process that I showed you before within the People tab. So I can create something new if I'd like to. For now, though, I'll just exit out of there. And we will say, since this is the practice assignment, I'm going to use the practice assignment group set. And of course, I could set my due date, everything else that I need to, and then hit save and publish. Now, once you've done that, like I mentioned before, only one student from each group will need to submit the assignment to you, and then Canvas will automatically copy that submission into all the other students who are in that group, and you can grade them in bulk a lot faster, unless you've checked that checkbox that says assign grades individually. Now that kind of wraps up our conversation about groups. So I'm going to pause one more time to give you opportunities for questions. Feel free to type a question, interject, but we'll move on to the last few things in just a moment. Any last thoughts, concerns, questions, fears, hopes for the future? All right. Uh, as we move on, I want to just return to our agenda so I could just touch on the last things that we're going to address today. Last session, we talked about item banks, so that may be familiar to you. I want to just briefly touch on that again today. We also talked about how to provide accommodations and quizzes. Again, I'm going to just briefly hit on that today, and then we'll review flexible due dates at the end. I think I'm going to swap the order of these just to make things run a little bit smoother. But what I want to do is I want to just point out those features one more time, just remind you of them. And then I want to talk a little bit about how all of these features together can help personalized learning for students. So we're going to start with item banks, and then we'll go to accommodations and then flexible due dates. Now, you may remember that when I am creating a quiz, and I'm going to actually create a new quiz right now so that I can show this to you. When I'm creating a quiz, I have the ability to put questions into that quiz, as you might expect, right? Like that's not extremely exciting per se. Obviously, if I'm making a quiz, I should be able to add questions to it. The thing that's powerful though is I can save questions into what's called item banks. And item banks are groups of questions that I can import into different quizzes, and Canvas will automatically select quiz or questions from that group of questions to put in people's quizzes. So as I'm in new quizzes, I can go here and click on plus, and then I have this little folder icon, and if I click on that, it will pull up the item banks that I have available in my course. Right now, I just have this sample item bank. And when I click on that, I then have the ability to insert those questions into my quiz. And I do that by just clicking on this plus button here. Now, by default, Canvas is going to say that each question is worth 1 point. If I had more than one question in this bank, right now I only have one question, but if I had more than one, Canvas would ask me how many questions I want to pull in. And then each student is going to receive questions at random from that bank. So to give you more of an example, let's say that I have a quiz on commas. This is something that I would do in my class quite frequently. I had an item bank that had like 40 questions in it. I didn't feel like I needed to give students a 40 question comma quiz. That felt a little excessive for my purposes. But I did want to give them 5 questions. And so what I would do is I would go to my item bank, select the item bank, add it like I just did here, and then I would say pull 5 questions at random from this bank. That means that student A, when they open up their quiz, they're going to receive different questions than student B because Canvas is just automatically pulling questions at random from that bank. That is your item bank feature. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that can be helpful to you in a moment. But again, I just wanted to touch on that one more time so that you hopefully remember what that is from our last session. The other thing that I want to touch on in quizzes is the ability to provide accommodations as needed. And you could do that under the Moderate tab. You may remember that I have essentially 2 different options. The first option is my accommodations tab, and I can click on that pencil and I can set some adjustments for the quiz. Or excuse me, I can set some adjustments for the student that will apply to all of the quizzes in my course. So for instance, if I decide that Val needs extra time for some reason, and I say, you know what, I want to add a time limit multiplier for every single quiz in my course, Val gets time and a half. Once I hit save, that then applies to all of the quizzes in my course. Additionally, though, I also have this moderate option where I can set those adjustments specific for just this quiz in and of itself. So I could say, you know what, generally speaking, Val doesn't need additional time, but I'm going to give Val some additional time just on this quiz, and I'm going to say she gets an extra hour for this one. Now, as you could see, those things can compound on each other. So Val already gets time and a half for all of her quizzes, but then she gets an extra hour on top of that for this quiz. Or I can remove her accommodation and say, you know what, Val doesn't really need a time multiplier. We're going to hit none here and hit save. She just needs an extra hour on this quiz in particular. So those options exist in quizzes as well. And again, hopefully that's familiar from the last session. If you weren't here during the last session, I know that Alex has a recording somewhere, so Pastor Alex for that. But that's your really quick overview of both of those quiz features so that you can start thinking about personalized learning. The last feature I want to show you before I talk a little bit more about the application of these features is oh, now my mind went blank. Oh, yes, flexible due dates. That's the last one I wanted to touch on here. So I'm going to hit return and just go back to one of my assignments, and it doesn't necessarily matter which one. But the last thing that I wanted to highlight is for any given assignment in Canvas, by default, Canvas is going to assign that assignment to everyone, like you can see right here. But I always have the ability to exit that out and just type in an individual student's name and then maybe add another assignment box and put in another student's name if I wanted to. And then I could set different due dates for those students based on their needs. So maybe Deborah needs a lot longer than Val for whatever reason, and I could put that in as needed. And then in my last box, I can also just say everyone else. And then I can set a due date for the rest of my students, whatever I feel is appropriate. That again is something that we talked about a couple of sessions ago. So hopefully that feels a little bit familiar to you. Hopefully it's something that you remember me talking about. But I wanted to point all of those out before we wrapped up today so that we could just talk about how some of these might start to function in your classroom. So I'm actually going to return to the agenda here because I just want to talk through a little bit of what we've discussed today. So the very first thing is we talked about peer reviews. And one of the things that is really helpful when we start sending students down their own learning pathways or personalizing learning for students, one of the things that the research has shown is really important in those scenarios is to still build in some sort of interdependence inside of your course, so that students still feel some sense of community inside of your course, or students still are able to learn from each other, because collaborative learning is really important. And so essentially the function of peer reviews here is we wanted to point out peer reviews first to just keep in mind that as we talk about customizing all these things for students, it's still really helpful for them to return to each other every now and then. With that said, a lot of the real power of Canvas comes into play when we are able to send students down those individualized pathways. So you may remember we talked about groups, we talked about it for a while, and we talked about those different group sets. I didn't point this out, but one of the things that you may have noticed about my group sets is that my first two group sets were differentiation and differentiation two. And I should have been a lot better in how I described these. But you could see that I have built in some groups that might be helpful for you in your course too, depending on how it works. So in my course that I taught when I was a high school teacher, I've dealt with a lot of multilingual students, which is something that I loved doing because they brought such a cool energy to my class. But it also made collaborative work a little bit trickier sometimes because I had to figure out ways that these students who had very limited English could collaborate with their peers still. And I would divide them up in multiple ways. One of the ways I would do it is some of the assignments, I wanted my Spanish speakers to work with my Spanish speakers, right? And so I might create a group set that sounded like language groups. And then one of the groups inside of my group set would be Spanish speakers. And then, as was often the case in my class, it would be like Spanish speakers too, because I'd have enough for a couple of groups. And then I'd have like English speakers one, English speakers two, English speakers three, and then like Chinese speakers one, whatever the case may be for you, right? But that was one of my group sets. And so with that, after I had created that, then in my classroom, what I could do is I could say something like, hey, you guys have your language groups. And I had defined those for students already. These are students who speak the same language as you. I want you to work with your language groups today. Go find those people. And then they could work with those people and turn things in on Canvas. But that wasn't the only grouping that I wanted to use, right? Because I also wanted to use groupings that mixed up my students and mixed up their ability levels. And so I had a group that was like mixed ability levels. And you could probably see where this is going, where I created like blue group, green group. It was just something random like that. But then I'd place students in those groups where I'd have one really high performer, one medium performer, one like between learner, so on and so forth. And you can organize that as needed. The point that I'm trying to make here is that one of the things that Canvas allows us to now do is organize students really efficiently so that maybe at the beginning of the year, after I'm a month in, or maybe I've had my students for a little while and I know who they are, I can build out a bunch of different groups in advance so that whenever I get to a point where I want students to work with these people or these people, it's really quick for me to push students into those groups. Additionally, though, I can also adjust what those groups have as far as like due dates and things like that based on their needs that way as well. With some of these other features, though, I'm also able to now provide students with a lot more opportunities than I could before. And what I mean by that is before I talked about this example of giving my students a commas quiz where I had all of my questions in an item bank. And I talked a little bit about this last time, so forgive me, I'm going to repeat myself just a little bit here. But one of the really powerful things about using an item bank like that is I could give students unlimited attempts on the quiz while still ensuring that they were receiving new or mostly new questions on each attempt so that they weren't simply memorizing the questions. This made it so that I could really quickly build in extra opportunities for success for my students without having to write a bunch of quizzes. The second thing, though, that became really powerful is by breaking apart my quizzes into question banks, it became really easy for me to differentiate for my students. So an example of this is I might have an item bank that this isn't a great example, but it's the first one that comes to mind. I might have one that's like easy comma questions, and then I might have another item bank that's like hard comma questions, right? And then what I can do is I can go in and I can build a quiz and I can name it like comma quiz one. And comma quiz one is going to randomly pull 4 easy comma questions and 1 hard comma question. And I could give that to most of my students. But then I have some other students who are way ahead of the game and I need to push them a little bit further. I can create comma quiz number 2. And in that quiz, I'm pulling maybe 1 easy comma question and 4 hard comma questions, something like that, right? And then my students are getting different things based on their performance that I've seen from them. I can also fragment that as much as I need to for a variety of content options where I could say, you know what? This student over here has demonstrated that they're really good at commas, but they don't have any clue how semicolons work. And they also need some help with thesis statements, something like that. I could create just like a thesis statement and semicolon quiz by pulling questions from item banks really quickly that I've already built. Whereas my other students might get questions that cover commas, semicolons, and thesis statements, all 3 based on what they need. And so having those item banks makes creating flexible quizzes, makes creating flexible quizzes really easy and really quick because I can just drag and drop questions wherever I need them. The last thing that I'll say, because we're pretty much at time, is these features right here where I can add in those accommodations and those flexible due dates. Those are great simply for accommodating students, which is probably apparent in them, like that's what they're named. But additionally, they're also really helpful when we're designing individualized pathways for students, because let's say that student A decided with me that they were going to undertake this fairly ambitious project. I might need to give that student a little bit more time than their peers if their peers have less ambitious projects. And maybe this student with a more ambitious project has one or two fewer assignments because they're doing this bigger thing. Whereas these students over here are getting a couple of extra assignments, but they're getting tighter deadlines because their project isn't quite as ambitious, right? And we'll talk more about building out those individualized learning pathways during our next session. But I just wanted you to start thinking about that is really the intent behind a lot of these features is simply to give you as the teacher the flexibility to say this student needs these things and this student needs these things. And now I have the ability to actually differentiate that. I no longer have to just provide the same thing to everyone all at the same time, at the same pace, all the time. And that's what's really exciting to me about some of these Canvas features is they allow so much personalization. Now, with that said, I have gone a minute over time, so please forgive me. And also, thank you for bearing with my little soapbox there at the end, but hopefully it sparked some ideas for you. As with our past sessions, I'm going to hang on the call for another minute to answer any questions that you may have. So feel free to stick on the call, ask as many questions as you need. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here. And I look forward to talking more about personalization in our next session next week. And I'll see you then.